Good morning and welcome to another session of the reading from my novel Letting Go. This time it's the subchapter 3 of the first chapter and the first part. Shake history off. Why are you working on women writers and artists who had to emigrate during the Nazi period? Bruno asked her. When I wrote my doctoral thesis on the writer Irena Kaun, I was initially happy to leave this period of Berlin's dark 1920s behind me, including Kaun's escape from the Nazis to the Netherlands, her return with the help of an SS man, and her life in illegality in Cologne. I wanted to devote myself to new topics, but various fates had not let go of me. Moreover, it was a coincidence that I had come to the subject area at all, until it caught up with me personally. What are you trying to say? Well, the professor with whom I'd started my doctoral thesis in Cambridge was not only an art historian, but also a literary scholar and interested in political history. In general, he loved interdisciplinary discussions. He researched and continues to research the influence of existential challenges on the shaping and changing of one's own identity, such as the migration of people. I must have told him about my own family once after one of the seminar sessions, probably during one of the invitations to a cafe, because he usually invited students for a coffee to discuss some thoughts from the lecture or seminar in more depth. I told him about the personal struggles I was having dealing with the history of the Nazi era. I suspect this provoked him to suggest that I should address my experiences, the knowledge I bring with me from home and the burdens they place on me, get to the bottom of them and write my doctoral thesis about them. He said that nothing was more important than a topic being personally challenging and more important than any intellectual effort. It had to grab me, he thought, also because I could distance myself from it by working on it. At first, I felt uneasy. I didn't know whether I should start my academic future with my own family, and was wavering that I was supposed to deal with this family and therefore my history. Sorry, please, said Bruno. I didn't realize what a can of worms I'd stirred up with my innocent question. And Bruno picked up a bottle of red wine, a beautiful Chateauneuf du Pape that he had ordered to celebrate the evening, and poured a little for Annika and himself, more out of embarrassment than anything else. He wanted to woo Annika that evening after they hadn't seen each other for a few days since their vacation in Crete. And Bruno still had a guilty conscience because he felt that Annika had to focus too much on him and that he had paid more attention to his own research than to her. Not at all, Annika said. You've actually only touched on something that has been on my mind for weeks, even months and years. And I will probably continue to occupy me even beyond my doctoral thesis and postdoctoral dissertation if it is ever finished and beyond these studies. How could it be that I was born in a family coming from Kassel that was deeply influenced by the Reformation and at the same time part of the darkest pages of German history? I was not aware of the family I grew up in, who or how my parents were. Had I ever heard a sound of all this back then? Bruno didn't want to stop her, but he had actually expected this evening, on which he had invited Annika to one of the selected French restaurants in Munich, to become a romantic dinner, but not a political history review of sad times. On the other hand, Annika had aroused his curiosity, as he was no stranger to this ghastly past due to his own history. Obviously, by telling Annika about his own family wounds, he had given her the confidence that she too could be willing to talk about hers. A different kind of mood emerged, albeit not a rosy romance, but more a brown drama, and yet the conversation drew them closer together. How is it that, if not as a teenager, how did you discover this secret about your family? He asked. I should have known by now, she said, and groaned. She reached for the refilled glass of deep red wine. Let's have a toast first, Bruno. I want to tell you how much I love you. The glasses didn't sound very harmonious because they were still too full, but that was about to change. They both took a good sip, paying attention to how the wine tasted, and Annika felt that she could and should open up more. You have to know that my mother's side of the family comes from Bremen, from a religious pietist tradition, which was very hostile to the lax Lutherans, who of course also existed and still exist in the free Hanseatic city. And then my mother had met this much older reformed soldier who had only returned home from Russian captivity in 1949. He could have been her father, but she had often mentioned that it was not easy for young girls to find a husband in the post-war period. Men were in short supply. The young ones had stayed in the war, many were missing or had died, and those who were a little older, because they had often been far behind the front line and had survived as prisoners of war, did not come home immediately after the war. However, my mother's explanation made me a little puzzled. Why had she fallen in love with this older man before the war started? As soon as she had lifted up, the starter was delivered. Apples carved with like honeycombs, the cracks filled with liver pate and caramelized with honey. The apple resembled a beehive. Bruno cut through his own, handed Annika a piece on his spoon, and stroked her arm with his fingers. She moved her mouth towards him, took the spoon with a piece of apple, put it on her tongue, opened her mouth, and let him taste a bit of the apple too. The trust you give me by telling me your story touches me and makes me understand you even better, said Bruno empathetically. Oh, thank you, Bruno. It's not easy for me to tell you about it, and as far as the more intimate things are concerned, you are the first person I've ever told. Please, as far as you want and are ready, Bruno emphasized, without giving her the feeling of curiosity or unwillingness. After being the only daughter in the house with three older brothers, I was the runt of the litter, mainly because the youngest of them is 9 years older than me. So I'm a latecomer, and my mother had made it clear to me more than once that she didn't really want me and shouldn't have had me. She had outgrown the household, the finances, and her four husbands. Wasn't she at least happy when she finally got a girl with you? Bruno objected. You would think so, but my feeling from childhood and adolescence was more that I was envied by her. My father, who could have been my grandfather, always kept an eye on me, so much that I often felt uncomfortable. You know that not anything happened but between us, but my dreams I often imagined that something had happened. There was such a veil of grey, yes, it still exists, that had spread over these memories and lies heavy on them. Annika's voice began to break. You don't have to go on, Bruno said, because he could feel Annika's tears welling up and she couldn't quite continue. Yes, it has to come out at some point. And if not with you, who else? Bruno moved a little closer to her without touching her, just a signal to her that he wanted to continue listening. Or did you have to tell him in order to get involved with him at all? She looked at him, no longer unsure as she had been a moment before, but fixed on him as if she didn't want to give him a way out, not him and not herself. Both mum and dad must have known that my middle brother had approached me, or actually, I should say, abused me. I can't remember exactly from what age. I don't know, maybe I was 6 or 7. He told me bedtime stories because mum and dad didn't care about me going to bed. They were busy with themselves or just wanted to watch TV together. My brother voluntarily and happily took over my bedtime routine. He came and He came to me, closer and closer, disgustingly. He reached for me into my innermost parts and he rubbed his own against them. Even though I didn't really know what was happening at the time, he made it clear to me that I shouldn't tell anybody about it, that it was our secret, part of the reading stories. And I remember that one evening when the story was taking too long, Dad came into the room. He must have noticed what was going on. But he simply switched off the light and told my brother to go to his room. That was all. He didn't confront him. Not then and never later. My mother's experience was no different. She knew it too. If not from Dad, then she must have sensed it from those extensive reading evenings. She must have known my fear. When I went into my room, my brother after me, when she came into my room and wanted to us both to go to sleep. You're telling me this for the first time and you couldn't confide in anyone in your family? Who should I? Mum was busy with herself and she would have loved to have me out of this world. My younger and older brothers had cherished my middle brother. He was the soul of the family after both parents had failed emotionally. And it had taken me years to even realize what I had to endure for years. I'll never forget when I just graduated from high school at 18. My middle brother invited me to go skiing in the Alps with the other two brothers. I thought to myself that if the other two were there, I would be safe. It wasn't until we were in the car that he told me that the other two had cancelled at short notice. Was it an excuse, a lie? Had he planned it that way from the start? What should I have done? On the one hand, I'd been looking forward to skiing. I hardly had the money to afford something like that on my own. And then I thought maybe everything wasn't as I remembered it was. And in the meantime, I'd been away for a few months on my voluntary social year. He was a grown man, no longer a teenager. I was a young woman. Hesitantly, I finally agreed and we set off. But you won't believe it. We had barely moved into our accommodation in the guest house south of Innsbruck, a room with two separate beds, got ready for the night. When he was sitting on the edge of the bed when I came out of the bathroom, he masturbated and asked me if I wanted to satisfy him with my mouth. I was speechless. Standing in the bathroom doorway, stunned, knowing I couldn't turn around or escape, but also unable to react in any way. I hadn't even dared to ask him how he had come up with this impertinence. Fainting came over me. The chimeras of past nightmares turned out to be real. And to this day, I don't know how I survived the night and that week of skiing. Bruno felt it burst out of her, more concerned than angry, more frightened than annoyed. He himself seemed powerless in the face of what he had just heard. You know, that's criminal. Have you never thought of going to the police, if not to your parents or brothers? Bruno, I come from a medium-sized city. Despite its size, everyone in Kassel knows everyone else. Besides, my father was a grammar school teacher. That would have been the end of the family and the end of me. And everyone holds my parents in the highest esteem. Dad was also a leading member of the local history association for many years, even an honorary member, was recognized as an authority. Everyone knew him from the hundreds of articles he had published on the history of the town and the region in the Kassel Nachrichten. He was also a member of the town council as a representative of the Independent Voters Association. How could I have cast a shadow on him, on Mum, and on my brothers? I thought I could eliminate the problem by keeping my distance. But I learned that neither time nor distance can undo the past. You can't shake it off. So I decided not to see my middle brother again for the foreseeable future, especially not alone. That was my escape strategy. I'm so sorry, she added. I didn't mean to ruin our date. It just came over me. I really just wanted to tell you about my dad, a story that I felt and feel no less dramatically. Oh God, thought Bruno. Another scary experience. What must Anika have been through? Yes, I didn't actually want to tell you about my siblings, but about him, my father, to answer your question about how I came to do my research. At least Bruno thought she seemed to have recovered, enough to be able and willing to continue. Dad was not a soul of man, but there was something grandfatherly about him. Reading had always been his great passion. He had completed a doctorate, which really impressed me. He was considered the great sage in the family. At the time, I had the impression that he knew everything, had traveled the world, and gained a lot of life experience. He had attended the famous Wilhelms Gymnasium, where he had graduated before the war, and had then gone to study in the intellectual strongholds of Marburg, Berlin, and Göttingen. As he modestly told me, in addition to German studies, his favorite subject, he also studied history, a little philosophy, and Protestant theology on the side. He needed all of this because his heart had begun to beat for medieval studies, and he really was a gifted historian of that time, even if he wasn't usually that interested in me. I will never forget, however, the walks and hikes with him when he took me to the historic Roman and even more so Germanic sites around Kassel and gave lectures to me on local history. From time to time, when I was a bit older, he also took me to the local club where he regularly gave lectures with slides. I almost always only knew him sitting at his desk as soon as he returned from grammar school in the afternoon, where he taught history, German, and religion. And what did he write his doctoral thesis on? Bruno asked, interrupting her and showing interest. I can't remember exactly the title, but he must have told me several times, but I know it was about Meister Eckhart. I remembered it well because my eldest brother is called Eckhart and because you've already told me about this Eckhart. Bruno's eyes began to lit up. Annika must have sensed it straight away. She was happy for him. How did you come across Eckhart? She asked him. That's a little story on my part. I'd never actually come across it during my studies in philosophy, ethics, and theology, but at the end of my studies, there was a radio college called Course Religion, a kind of lecture series on the radio that you could sign up for, which I did. It was a good opportunity to earn some money and gain experience in teaching at the time. Annika grinned. They clinked glasses together. In the meantime, the Chateaubriand arrived, blood red, of course. Annika had never eaten such tender meat before. In fact, she felt a little overwhelmed. She was surprised how Bruno answered the waiter's initial question about the wine selection. He didn't name a specific wine to the waiter, who was standing rather stiffly and didn't want to look like an ordinary waiter, but requested a dry French red wine. Whereupon the waiter came with two glasses and let Bruno taste them. The waiter asked him if he liked one of the two glasses. Bruno took a small sip from the first, had a piece of baguette in between, then tasted the other wine, smelled both glasses again, and finally decided on one of the two glasses. Somewhat defiantly, he was asked if he could guess which direction the wine he had chosen came from. Without hesitation, Bruno replied that the first one was probably grown not far from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It was the wine he had chosen. And when the waiter brought the bottle and poured it, it really did say on the label, Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Annika was mightily impressed, but didn't have the feeling that Bruno was going for it. It came far too naturally from his lips, and it resonated more like infatuation with a hobby passion. Conversely, he was all ears when she talked about herself. Not only did he remember details, he also asked questions and admitted when he didn't understand something. She felt that they were similar in this respect. She was also interested and wanted to know who she was sitting at the table with. So she encouraged him to continue. I had good basic knowledge. I didn't get a bad degree in Eichstätt. in Bavaria. So I applied and got the job. And from then on, after the college started, I accompanied a discussion group of about 20 people who all followed the college on the radio and with whom I met once a month to review the content and prepare them for the final exam. Not only did I myself have the advantage of also receiving the teacher preparation materials with all the questions and answers, I had already made the experience back then that you learn best what you teach and study. And so it was extremely happy for me, and I was proud that the majority of my study group also did excellently. But I didn't really want to talk about that. You had asked me about Meister Eckhart. In fact, one teaching unit dealt with religion and mysticism. And it was the first time I came across some greats that I'd never heard of during my studies. St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Friedrich Hölderlin, Sri Aurobindo, Jean Gebser, Edith Stein, and the oldest of this list was Meister Eckhart, who lived in the 14th century. And the group met again. After the exam to celebrate together, the desire for regular meetings was expressed. In a way, it was not inconvenient for me after all. I had decided to go into practical training for priests in the Diocese of Speyer after my studies. The Volksbildungswerk had included the continuation of this college study group in its program and had not only promised me a reimbursement of travel expenses, but had also given me an educational assignment so that I could finance my practical training and trips to my family to a certain extent through my work as a lecturer. From all the topics that had been covered in the radio college, the group voted unanimously that they wanted to delve further into the writings and thoughts of Meister Eckhart. That was my introduction to Eckhart. So for the next 2 years, we read texts by Eckhart once a month, which I had to prepare and then accompany in conversation. And after 2 years, we finally switched to the writings of Jean Gebser, which were followed by those of Sri Aurobindo and Edith Stein. You see, after my actual studies, I read myself into the history of mysticism, or perhaps even better, I taught myself. And the habilitation thesis I'm currently writing sheds light on the path of ethics from late antiquity to Eckhart. Annika smiled with pleasure at Bruno. I draw a lot of strength from all of this, she said, because I seem to have taught myself most of it intuitively during my studies. Of course, I learned a lot from my professors and teachers, but I experienced much more intensely what I read and discussed with fellow students and what I grappled with myself. I still find it super exciting, like tonight with you, to explore things I have no idea about. I find it particularly exciting that you also have an intellectual connection to my dad. However, you'll have to explain to me why you and the study group got stuck on Eckhart. I was more than suspicious of Eckhart later in life. Isn't there a direct or indirect connection between his teachings and the National Socialist ideology? Bruno was not surprised by this question because he was no stranger to Eckhart's reception under National Socialism. He himself had used the most common translation of this writing when studying Eckhart, published after the war by the famous Eckhart scholar, editor, and translator Joseph Quint. This brings a bit more personal history into our relationship, Bruno resumed, because when I told my father, who was a librarian at Saarland University, about my reading circle, he threw up his hands. No, he said, Eckhart, of all people. Then you'll probably also read Quint's translation of these texts. Yes, I said. It's the only faithful translation. Faithful, replied my father, who was rather unideological and a man of quiet words. Faithful he was, but even after the war, he was still one of the brown figures, even at our university. He had already become a member of the NSDAP before the war and belonged to a number of National Socialist Party organizations, even as a supporting member of the SS. Quint seems to have taken all this upon himself, not only to be able to write about Eckhart, but he saw Eckhart as part of National Socialist ideology and propaganda. And he was not alone in this attitude. You know, my father continued, the chief ideologue of the regime, Alfred Rosenberg, who was executed after the war, had taken Eckhart as the forerunner, creator, and chief witness of the new Germanic religion in his notorious book, The Myth of the 20th Century from 1930. His book even begins with a quote from Eckhart, and Quint had begun his work under this umbrella at the time. He had done it to make Germanness great, and after the war, he continued it as if the Holocaust had not taken place and the totalitarian regime had not plunged the world into the greatest misfortune of the 20th century. Soon after he returned from Russian captivity as a prisoner of war, one of the academic examination boards had reservations about him being allowed to teach at the university again. But Quint managed to be classified as exonerated despite history. And so he came to our Saarland University, where the Eckhart Institute was also transferred to. As a young librarian who had to deal with history, I was repeatedly subjected to the aggression of this brown sock until he was finally appointed to Cologne. Annika listened with pricked ears. I was surprised, even shocked, when I heard my father use the word brown sock, because he has rarely been emotional, and never insulting, and certainly not quick-tempered. But in this case, I sensed years of resentment and an inner sting that I didn't usually recognize in him. Good to hear this side of the story, Annika said. I also have my share of family experience to what you've been through, but I think the evening is too beautiful. Let's shake off history for today and enjoy the fact that we found each other and can sit here together. Bruno was relieved. He would have liked to get even more involved with Annika, but she had obviously sensed how much effort he had made for her with the choice of restaurant, by having her picked up from the station by cab, the hotel he had chosen for her, and where they could get dressed for each other before the restaurant visit, and also with the prospect of them ending the evening together in a bar after dinner. Annika put her finger on his mouth, opened hers, and the story sank into itself for that evening. Thank you for listening, and sorry about this noise from the computer. I'm not a specialist in computers, so let's see. Thank you very much, and I think tomorrow, after tomorrow, we have the final subchapter of chapter 1. Thank you. Don't forget, if you want, subscribe to the channel. Bye-bye.